On March 21, 2022, a Boeing 737-800 carrying 132 people fell out of the sky in southern China. The aircraft was at cruising altitude on a routine domestic flight in good weather with an experienced crew. 2 minutes after something went wrong at 29,000 feet, it struck a mountain in Guangxi at roughly 350 miles per hour. There was no crash in the conventional sense. There was disintegration. For 4 years, the Chinese government refused to say what happened. It had the wreckage, it had both black boxes, it had the cockpit voice recording within 72 hours. It had every piece of evidence it could possibly need, and it said nothing. Then, on the 1st of May, 2026, the answer came out anyway. Not from Beijing, from a document released in Washington that China never wanted the world to see. And what it revealed about the final 23 seconds of Flight 5735 explains both why this airplane went down and why a government spent 4 years burying the reason. This is the story of China Eastern Flight 5735. Before we dive deep into the investigation, let's quickly rewind to what happened that afternoon. It was a Monday, the kind of afternoon nobody remembers until they have to. The aircraft took off from Kunming at 1:15 p.m., bound for Guangzhou, a routine 2-hour flight across southern China, 123 passengers, 9 crew. Overcast skies, but calm. The airplane climbed normally, leveled off at 29,000 feet, and settled into its cruise. For nearly an hour, nothing happened. The pilots were in normal contact with air traffic control, no distress calls, no anomalies, no requests for descent. Everything was as it should have been. Then at 2:20 p.m., something went wrong. The aircraft tipped forward and began falling out of the sky. It dropped at vertical speeds exceeding 32,000 feet per minute. The controller called the cockpit again and again. There was no answer, no mayday, no emergency signal. The airplane was simply falling. For a few seconds in the middle of the descent, something or someone pulled it out of the dive. It climbed briefly from around 7,400 feet, back up to over 9,000. Then it plunged again, this time without pause. At 2:22 p.m., it struck a mountain in Guangxi at around 350 miles per hour. The impact was so violent that nothing bigger than the size of a hand was left. All 132 people on board died instantly. That was the event. For 4 years, the question of why it happened would be buried under one of the most disciplined information operations a modern government has ever run. To understand how, you have to start with the airplane and with who was sitting in the cockpit. The aircraft itself was almost aggressively unremarkable. A Boeing 737-800, registration B-1791, delivered new to China Eastern in June of 2015. At the time of the crash, it had flown just under 7 years and accumulated more than 18,000 flight hours, the middle of its useful life. The 737-800 is one of the most flown airframes in the world, with thousands in service across every continent. It is considered by the people who fly it and the people who insure it as safe as any narrow body in the sky. And there is a piece of context that matters more the longer this story goes on. In the spring of 2022, China was in the middle of one of the strictest lockdown regimes the modern world had ever seen. Information was being managed across every corner of public life under what the government called Zero COVID, run by the most sophisticated information control system any state had ever built. This crash did not happen in a quiet political moment. It happened inside a country that had spent 2 years perfecting the discipline of controlling what its citizens were allowed to know. There was nothing unusual in the forecast, the maintenance log, or the flight plan. But there was something unusual about who was sitting in the cockpit. There were 3 pilots that afternoon, not 2, 3. And the third one is where this story stops being ordinary. The captain was Yang Hongda, 32 years old, around 6,700 flight hours. A 737 captain since 2018. By every public account, qualified, healthy, in good standing. China Eastern would later state more than once, and with what came to seem like unusual emphasis, that his health, his family, and his finances were all stable. The first officer was Zhang Zhengping, 59 years old, 31,769 flight hours. Hold that number for a moment. Zhang was a 40-year veteran, a flight instructor who had personally trained more than 100 captains. He held the title of Designated Check Airman from the Civil Aviation Administration of China, also known as CAC, one of the most senior pilot designations in Chinese aviation. And in 2011, he had been awarded the honorary title of Meritorious Pilot, given to only a small number of pilots in a generation. He had flown 4 different aircraft types in a career that began before Yang Hongda was born. And on Flight 5735, this man was sitting in the first officer's seat, on a flight commanded by a captain 27 years his junior. The airline has never publicly explained why. The third person in that cockpit was Ni Gongtao, 27 years old, 556 flight hours. He was there as an observer to learn how senior pilots flew the line. He would not. The wreckage came down in a forested valley near a village called Molang, 200 kilometers from the nearest major city, a place most Chinese citizens had never heard of, and most foreign reporters could not find on a map. By the next morning, the first pieces were being pulled from the bamboo and the scorched earth, and by that same morning, the natural remoteness of the site was being reinforced by something else. Access roads were secured, checkpoints went up, movement in and out of the valley was controlled. The airplane had come down in a place the state could manage. The reaction at the top of the government was immediate. Within hours, Xi Jinping called for investigators to determine the cause as soon as possible and to ensure absolute aviation safety. Chinese leadership called publicly for open, timely, and transparent publication of information about the crash. Read those words again: open, timely, transparent. They are the words the Chinese government chose on the day of the crash. They are the words that become harder to look at the longer this story goes on. The disruption was immediate and national. Within 24 hours, nearly 3/4 of all flights scheduled in China the next day had been cancelled. China Eastern grounded its entire 737-800 fleet. It was the heaviest single-day disruption of Chinese aviation in months. The recovery operation was the largest of its kind in modern Chinese aviation history. Heavy rain turned the impact crater into a shallow lake that had to be pumped out. Investigators would eventually catalogue tens of thousands of pieces of wreckage, most no bigger than a child's hand. By March the 29th, the remains of all 132 occupants had been identified through DNA and fingerprint comparison. There were no bodies to bury. There were chemical results that matched the people who had been waiting in Guangzhou. That was how the families learned with certainty that their relatives were gone. And among the wreckage in the bamboo and the scorched undergrowth, investigators found the small things that pull a story like this out of statistics: wallets, identification cards, and then the marriage certificates, more than 10 of them. The families were beginning to understand what had happened to them. They were assembled at Guangzhou Airport, the destination their relatives had been flying toward, and from there, a process began that has become standard practice in modern Chinese mass casualty events. Each of the 74 families was assigned a task force, typically 3 people, an airline representative, a worker from the deceased's hometown, and a counselor. More than 300 China Eastern staff were sent to support the families. The framing in every statement was compassion. The mechanism, as observers would note, was also containment. Some of the families did not want to be contained. They wanted to see the crash site. At first, the local government refused and asked them to stay in their hotels. The father of one victim, an 18-year-old student named Jiang Zhu, was among the parents who pushed back. "If they are alive," he told a reporter, "we want to see people. If they have died, we want to see the body." By the time he said those words, his son's body did not exist as a body. It existed as fragments matched through DNA to a name on a passenger manifest. Within 24 hours of the families being assembled, the compensation process had already begun. Within 10 days, insurers had paid out the equivalent of more than $2 million. And here is what is strange about that. The cause of the crash had not been determined. The black boxes had not been read. The investigation had barely begun. Yet the insurers, the airline, and the regulator were already moving as if they knew something the families had not been told. Because while the compensation was being paid, another process was running in parallel. State media coverage in those first days focused almost entirely on the emergency response. Lists of equipment, inventories of provisions, profiles of the rescuers. Online commentators in China gave it a name. They called it rainbow farts, an idiom for empty official praise that floats colorfully into the air and says nothing. The questions ordinary Chinese citizens were asking were different. They wanted to know about the airplane, the maintenance, the pilots. They wanted to know what kind of aircraft falls out of the sky on a clear afternoon with no warning. Those questions, asked in detail, began to disappear. Articles were deleted. Posts were removed. Journalists who traveled to the crash site were blocked. Only state media was allowed in. 5 days after the crash, the Cyberspace Administration of China published a list of 7 specific online rumors it said had to be suppressed, and named the accounts behind them. And there was one thing China Eastern volunteered before anyone formally asked. As speculation spread about whether the airline had cut maintenance during the pandemic, a spokesperson said its maintenance spending in 2021 had actually risen 12% over 2019, despite flying far less. It was a careful, preemptive answer to a question no one had officially raised. Maintenance, the airline wanted the world to know, was not the problem. But the most important evidence was no longer in China's hands alone. The cockpit voice recorder was found 2 days after the crash, badly damaged outside, but with its memory intact. The flight data recorder was found buried 1.5 meters deep in the soil. In the first week of April, both were flown to a laboratory in Washington, D.C. The country that built the airplane, not the country where it crashed, would be the first to read the data. There was a reason for that. Under international convention, the recorders could have stayed in China, and Chinese labs had the equipment to read them. But Boeing built the aircraft. The FAA was the state of design, and the standard practice in a crash like this is for the NTSB to handle the analysis. China invited the Americans in. Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg confirmed it publicly. For a brief moment, this looked like exactly the kind of cooperative investigation that produces a final report within a year or two. It would become the opposite, and the data those Americans pulled off the recorder is the reason why. First, though, came the preliminary report. On April the 11th, the CAAC issued a statement aimed not at foreign media, but at its own. Domestic speculation about the cause, it said, had gravely misled the public and interfered with the investigation. The regulator was telling Chinese journalists, and through them Chinese citizens, to stop asking what had happened. 9 days later, it published the report it was required to issue under international convention. It arrived on day 30 exactly, the bare minimum. The crew held valid licenses. They had rested, they had passed their medicals, the aircraft had been maintained to standard, no dangerous goods, no dangerous weather. Radio contact had been normal, right up until the aircraft left cruise. It did not say what caused the crash. It said what didn't. The airplane was fine, the engines were fine. The crew was qualified and rested, the weather was fine. And in everything it ruled out, it was circling something it would not put into words. If nothing was wrong with the plane, then what was left? 8 weeks would pass before anyone answered that question in public. And when the answer came, it did not come from Beijing. It came from a newspaper in New York. On May the 17th, 2022, the Wall Street Journal reported that black box data, analyzed at the NTSB, suggested the crash had been deliberate. The data, according to people familiar with the US assessment, showed that someone in the cockpit had pushed the airplane into the dive. The line that every outlet repeated came from one of those officials. The plane, they said, did what it was told to do by someone in the cockpit. The reporting was not speculative. It was sourced to multiple American officials with direct knowledge of the analysis, and it rested partly on a process of elimination. After a crash with a mechanical cause, regulators issue urgent directives to airlines worldwide, telling them what to check. In 8 weeks, no such directive had come. The silence on mechanical faults, the Americans believed, was itself a kind of evidence. China Eastern responded within a day, saying, No hard evidence supported the speculation, and repeating the line from the beginning. The pilots' health was good, their families were stable, their finances were sound. Nothing was wrong. The government itself did not respond. The foreign ministry deflected, state media ignored it, and inside China, the story was censored within hours. But it was not censored before the family saw it. In the days after the report, one bereaved relative told a Hong Kong newspaper, "The only thing such a person can say, if this is true, we deserve an explanation. The airline owes us one. The government owes us one." There was no response. There would not be. And this is where the silence became something more specific. Beijing was no longer just withholding information. It was refusing to engage with a question posed in public by the country that had built the airplane. It did not call the report wrong. It did not call it right. And in saying nothing, it told the families that whatever the Americans had found, it would not be discussed. By midsummer, the recorders were back in China, the data extracted, copies handed to the CAC. The Americans kept their right to take part. But under international convention, the investigation belonged to the country where the crash happened. That country was China. And China, holding all of it, said nothing. And then time began to pass. The first anniversary, March 2023. Under international convention, China owed the world a progress report. What it issued was brief. The investigation was ongoing. The accident was very complicated and very rare. No cause, no findings, no detail. In a normal investigation, that kind of statement is a placeholder between real disclosures. By now, it was clear the placeholder was all the CAC intended to give. The second anniversary, 2024. Another short statement. No anomalies in the aircraft. The engines, the systems, the crew, the weather, or air traffic control. All procedures followed. Still no cause. Still no report. The wording read almost word for word, like the year before. The Americans had handed Beijing a dataset that pointed toward a deliberate act in the cockpit. The CAC had that data. It had the voice recording, and it had decided no one outside would learn what any of it showed. For the families, the silence changed texture with each passing year. At first, they were told, investigations take time, and asked for patience. By the second anniversary, the people assigned to support them were running out of things to say. Some began to organize, comparing what they had been told privately against what was said in public. Some posted online about what they were not being told, and their posts vanished. Some traveled to Beijing and were redirected to officials back home. And then the anniversaries stopped. March 2025 came and went, and the CAC issued nothing at all. No report, no update, no acknowledgement that 3 years had passed since one of the deadliest air disasters in the country's history. For the first time, the agency had stopped pretending. And here is what made that silence so strange. This is not an agency that normally hides air crashes. China has had other accidents over the past 2 decades, and by international standards, it handled most of them in line with global norms. When a Henan Airlines jet crashed on a night landing in 2010, killing 44 people, the cause, pilot error in poor visibility, was difficult and politically uncomfortable. It was published anyway. Lessons were drawn. Training changed. That was how the CAC had handled crashes for 20 years. Flight 5735 was the exception, and an agency does not make an exception like that unless what it has found is something it cannot afford to say. Which brings us to May of 2025, when something happened that put the silence on the record in a way the agency could not undo. A Chinese citizen, whose identity has never been disclosed, filed a formal information request with the CAC, asking it to release the progress report that by international convention and by the agency's own rules was supposed to exist. The request used the legal channels available to Chinese citizens under China's own information disclosure regulations. The CAC responded in writing, and the response, in a translation circulated publicly and reproduced by the tracking service Flight Radar 24, said something aviation investigators around the world had to read twice. Disclosure of the report, the agency wrote, may endanger national security and social stability. Citing its own information disclosure regulations, it declined to release it. Read those words again. National security, social stability. Those are the words a country uses about state secrets, about military operations, about espionage. They are not the words a country uses about the cause of a plane crash. A regulator does not invoke national security to hide a maintenance fault. It does not invoke social stability over a pilot who got disoriented in a storm. Those findings get published and learned from. A regulator reaches for those words only when it judges the truth to be more dangerous than the silence. And remember Xi Jinping's words from the day of the crash: open, timely, transparent. They now sat beside a written refusal that called disclosure a threat to national security. The government never explained the contradiction. The contradiction was the point. By the start of 2026, the silence had held for nearly 4 years, and it looked permanent. The families had stopped expecting an answer. The international aviation community had run out of ways to ask for one. And the body that sets global aviation standards for all its rules requiring countries to publish their findings had no power to make China do anything. The system that exists to make sure plane crashes get explained simply has no tool to compel a permanent member of its own governing council. And then someone found a way around it. In January of 2026, a Chinese citizen filed a Freedom of Information Act request with the United States National Transportation Safety Board, asking for everything it held on the crash of Flight 5735. Just a form filed under a foreign country's transparency law by someone who had run out of options at home. And the logic of that law was simple. Under American rules, the NTSB must release its material on a foreign accident 2 years after the crash, or once the final report is published, whichever comes first. 4 years had passed. There was no final report. The NTSB had no legal grounds to refuse. And then, out of nowhere, on the 29th of April 2026, it released a 33-page package. The flight data recorder readout, correspondence between the NTSB and the Chinese investigators, a data download report from July of 2022. 2 days later, the NTSB published it on its own website. 4 years and 40 days after the crash, the first official document about what happened inside Flight 5735 was finally public. It had not come from the country that ran the investigation. It had come from the country that built the airplane, because Beijing would not allow it out at home. And what it showed was the thing the Chinese government had spent 4 years refusing to say. For most of the flight, everything was normal. The aircraft climbed, leveled at 29,000 feet, and cruised. No warnings, no faults, no sign of anything wrong with the machine. And then at cruising altitude, the fuel control switches for both engines moved from run to cut off, one after the other within about 1 second. The instant they moved, both engines began to shut down. You have to understand what those switches are to understand what that means. They are not buttons you can brush by accident. On a 737, each one sits behind a guard, and to move it, you have to grip it, lift it up and over a metal detent, and push it down. The design exists for one reason: to make it almost impossible to shut an engine off by mistake. Turbulence cannot move them. An elbow cannot move them. Moving one is a deliberate, two-part action. Moving both is that action done twice. The moment the fuel was cut, the airplane began to die. The engines spooled down, the power failed, the autopilot disconnected, and then 3 seconds later, one of the control columns was pushed hard forward into the dive. The aircraft rolled at one point, all the way through a full 360 degrees. 23 seconds after the switches were cut, the recorder lost power and went dark because the engines that fed it were dead. Those 23 seconds are the only record the world will ever have from inside that descent. And in them, the fuel was shut off by hand, the power was starved out of the airplane, and the nose was driven toward the ground. 3 independent experts who reviewed the data, including a former NTSB investigator, reached the same careful conclusion. It is consistent with the fuel being cut manually and with deliberate inputs to the controls. This was the finding that sat inside the recorder for 4 years, while the CAC called the truth a matter of national security. The plane, as the American official said all along, did exactly what it was told to do. But the data can only take us so far. It tells us the switches were cut by a hand in that cockpit. It does not tell us whose. And the one piece of evidence that could name them, the cockpit voice recording from those final 2 minutes, is sitting in a drawer in Beijing. Someone there has heard it. So whose hand was on those switches? 3 pilots were in that cockpit, and one of them had 31,000 hours. In the next video, we take each of them apart.